Wait, how did that silver ring come to be around your neck? 5 years after his wife's supposed death, Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. In the muddy market square of Winchester, it was the exact moment he saw the heavy silver ring, the very one he had placed on his wife's finger with his own hands, hanging from a leather cord around the neck of a little boy sitting by a merchant's stall. And beside that boy sat a woman in a worn linen gown, accompanied by twin children who shared Arthur's exact features. 5 years ago, Arthur had received the grim tidings that his wife had perished. From the sweating sickness, he had beaten his chest in agony and wept over the cold stone grave that bore her name. Yet here, in the middle of the bustling market, the undeniable trace of his supposedly dead wife had reappeared. How did Arthur's wife, Elara, survive those long, brutal years to stand before him once again with their children? Thank you for visiting our Tavern of Tales. Your coin of support and kind words are always cherished. Now, let our moving tale of old begin. Listen closely, friends, for the tale I share today is a bitter and heartbreaking saga that unfolded within the stone walls of a wealthy merchant, lord's estate in medieval England. It is the story of a high-born family that, blinded by the empty pride of their station, drove their own flesh and blood into the unforgiving cold. By the time this tale ends, your heart will ache and ache again. Come, let us step into the past. Just behind the grand cobbled road of the city, there stood a massive stone manor house with a sprawling slate roof. It was the grand estate of a wealthy merchant family who controlled the trade of fine wool, silks, and rare spices. The absolute ruler of this manor was the matriarch, Lady Eleanor, since her husband, the old master, had passed away early. Lady Eleanor had taken the ledger into her own hands and commanded the merchant, the guild, with an iron fist. There was not a single mercer in the city who did not the formidable name of Lady Eleanor. With vast wealth came an obsession, with high-born pride, and she valued the strict rules of noble society and the honor of her house more than life itself. Lady Eleanor had but one child, her sole heir, Arthur. He was a capable young man of 23 winters, but yet this son was entirely different from his mother. While walking through the market, he would readily press silver pennies into the hands of a starving beggar, or take off his own warm woolen cloak to wrap around a shivering orphan in the rain. He possessed a warm and righteous heart, always valuing the souls of people above the weight of gold. Lady Eleanor was proud of her son, but at the same time, a deep unease gnawed at her. A dark premonition lingered in the corner of her heart that his gentle nature would one day bring ruin to their noble house. That dark premonition became reality one spring day in the muddy market square. Arthur was passing through the southern gates of the market town. A gang of street ruffians had surrounded a small, rickety wooden stall, causing a scene and demanding a cut of the coin for the right to sell. Behind the stall sat a young woman, perhaps 20 years of age, her head bowed and her fists tightly clenched. The blood had rushed to her cheeks, but the look in her eyes as she bit her lip To hold back her tears was not fierce, but rather remarkably steadfast. The woman's name was Elara. She was a low-born peasant, possessing neither wealth nor a family name. On her stall lay a few embroidered sweet bags made from scrap linen, along with some delicate needlework. One of the ruffians kicked her wares, scattering them into the dirt. Arthur strode forward and grabbed the ruffian by the shoulder, spinning him around. He pulled several silver shillings from his belt pouch, threw them at the thug's feet, and ordered them to leave at once. Recognizing the fine velvet doublet and the crest of Arthur's wealthy house, the thugs slowly backed away into the alleys. As Arthur picked up the scattered sweet bags one by one from the mud and placed them back on the wooden board, his eyes fell upon the embroidery on a piece of scrap fabric his fingers had brushed against. It was a pattern of two wildflowers, their stems intertwined. Every single stitch was so immaculate and pure that it seemed as though living flowers were breathing upon the cloth. Arthur's gaze lingered on the embroidery. For a long time, Elara kept her head bowed and muttered in a low voice, warning the young lord that if he touched the wares of a low-born girl, his noble hands would be soiled. Arthur brought the sweet bag to his nose, breathed in the scent of dried lavender, and offered a gentle smile. He told her that the scent was so sweet and the needlework so pure. How could the hands that crafted such beauty ever be considered soiled? Elara slowly raised her head. Above her dirt-smudged cheeks, her clear, bright eyes looked up at Arthur, and within them, surprise and a shy warmth spread like ripples on a pond. At that single glance, Arthur felt as though his heart had stopped beating. From that day forth, Arthur visited the market square every single day. He would stand in the shade of an old oak tree in the back alley, watching Elara sew for hours on end. Some days, he would buy honey cakes from the baker and leave them by her stall. At first, Elara did not even turn her head, but after 5 days had passed, she began to offer him a shy, gentle smile. On the 10th day, instead of buying extravagant jewels or fine silks, Arthur went to the blacksmith in the market alley. He spent his own allowance to forge a heavy, unpolished silver ring. The blacksmith tilted his head, saying that with this much silver, he could craft a fine noble's brooch, but Arthur simply smiled and said the ring was perfect. It was an evening when the full moon hung high in the sky. The market had closed, and the crowds had emptied out. Beside the bare wooden stall, Arthur carefully took Elara's hand. Every joint of her fingers was calloused from years of harsh needlework. But Arthur slipped the heavy silver ring onto her rough hand and spoke softly. He told her that this ring was more precious to him than a mountain of gold, and asked her to stay by his side for the rest of his days. Large, heavy tears fell from Elara's eyes. For a low-born peasant girl to receive a proposal from the heir of a grand manor was something she could not have imagined even in her wildest dreams. Elara wept for a long time before finally nodding her head. Beneath the moonlight, a desperate vow that transcended the bounds of class and birth was sealed. When Lady Eleanor heard the news, her reaction was as fierce as a blazing fire. She overturned the heavy oak dining table, struck her son across the face, and fiercely commanded him to cut ties with that low-born filth immediately. The manor servants all bowed their heads and trembled in fear, but Arthur did not back down. He starved himself for 3 days, kneeling on the cold stone floor of the great hall. Finally, Lady Eleanor gritted her teeth and took a step back. A quiet church wedding was held, but Lady Eleanor's eyes were colder than the bitterest winter frost. Even when Elara offered her the deepest bow of respect, the matriarch did not so much as nod. She despised even the sight of an extra wooden spoon placed at the dining table. Every morning, Elara rose before the sun. She went straight to the manor's kitchens to light the hearth fires, swept the courtyard, and scrubbed the clay crocks in the pantry. She washed her mother-in-law's heavy woolen garments by hand, beating them clean, and at night, by the dim light of a tallow candle, she sewed warm woolen hose for the matriarch to wear in winter. Lady Eleanor pretended not to see any of this, but Elara performed her duties silently, without a single word of resentment. A few months after the wedding, Elara began to show signs of carrying a child. The village midwife examined her and declared she was carrying twins. Arthur's eyes filled with tears of joy as he tightly held Elara's hands. Lady Eleanor's expression, however, was twisted and strange. The joy of her bloodline continuing clashed violently upon her face with the disgust that this noble blood was growing in the womb of a commoner. However, there was a seed of misfortune in this manor far darker than anything else, and that was Arthur's older sister, Margaret. Past her 30th winter, Margaret had been married for 10 years, but had failed to bear a child. Cast out by her husband, she had been sent back to her childhood home in disgrace. The shame of being abandoned and the deep humiliation of being a barren woman had seeped into her very bones. To Margaret's eyes, the sight of her sister-in-law, Elara, was an unbearable insult. That a low-born peasant could monopolize the absolute devotion of her brother? And on top of that, carry the children that Margaret herself could never have, caused a blinding fire of jealousy to erupt in Margaret's chest. Every night, Margaret ground her teeth in her bedchamber. Sitting alone before a flickering candle, she would scratch the woody floorboards with her fingernails, muttering over and over that she could no longer stand to see that wretched woman smiling in this house. Her jealousy grew darker, twisting into a murderous obsession. At last, the day arrived when Arthur had to leave on a long merchant caravan to a distant northern province. Because it was a major trade expedition that would take many months, Arthur's heart was heavy with worry about leaving his heavily pregnant wife behind. The night before his departure, beneath the glow of the candle, Elara carefully cut strands of her own long hair. She wove them together with strong hemp threads, stitch by stitch, to craft a sturdy pair of woven traveling shoes. She poured her deepest prayers for her husband's safe return into every single knot. In the early hours of the dawn, Elara secretly tucked the woven shoes deep inside her sleeping husband's leather saddlebags. When Arthur mounted his horse and disappeared beyond the grand iron gates, Elara stood at the entrance for a long time, watching the dust rise on the castle road. The children kicked in her swollen belly. Elara gently stroked her stomach and whispered in a low, soothing voice, telling her little ones that their father would surely return and that they must wait for him. But Elara did not know. She did not know that from the shadows of the servants, quarters behind the gate, her sister-in-law, Margaret, was watching her every move. The corners of Margaret's mouth slowly curled upward. She had waited 3 long months for Arthur to leave, and finally her chance had come. On the very night Arthur departed, Margaret summoned old Barnaby, the aging manservant who had been her loyal shadow for over 10 years, to her bedchamber. She locked the heavy wooden door, pulled a small linen pouch filled with silver, coins from her bodice, and pressed it into old Barnaby's hands. She instructed the old servant to go to the back alleys of the market, find the street ruffian who used to harass Elara, give him the silver, and make him do exactly as she commanded. Old Barnaby bowed his head low and vanished into the darkness. A few days later, the wicked trap Margaret had set began to snap shut. A vile, forged love letter written on sealed parchment, made to look as though a ruffian had carelessly dropped it, along with a worn leather riding glove belonging to a strange man, were cunningly hidden beneath Elara's wooden sewing box. Margaret feigned complete innocence. She went to her mother's chambers, forced tears into her eyes, and said, "Mother, I saw something dreadful beneath my sister-in-law's sewing box, but it is too shameful for my lips to speak of." Making Lady Eleanor search Elara's room herself was the final piece of Margaret's calculated design. When Lady Eleanor pulled the sealed parchment and the leather glove from beneath the sewing box, her face turned ashen pale. Her fingertips trembled violently, and the sound of her teeth chattering echoed through the stone chamber. To Lady Eleanor, the honor of her house was a matter of life and death. She had barely endured the whispers of the high-born nobility for taking in a low-born daughter-in-law, and now, with the supposed proof of that daughter-in-law's infidelity right before her eyes, all reason evaporated from her mind. Lady Eleanor dragged Elara out into the muddy courtyard and forced her to her knees. She screamed that a filthy peasant had dared to soil their noble house, demanding to know whose vile seed she was, truly carrying in her belly. Elara, having no idea what was happening, fell to clasp the matriarch's legs, looking upward to swear her innocence by Christ. Cruel manor guards violently dragged her across the rough stone, drawing blood. But Lady Eleanor did not even turn her head to look. Margaret stood leaning against a wooden pillar in the shadows, her head bowed, but the corners of her lips were trembling with a suppressed, malicious smile. It was the dead of winter, a night when a brutal blizzard howled fiercely through the estate. Lady Eleanor ordered 2 manor guards to drag her heavily pregnant daughter-in-law out through the rear gates. They gave Elara nothing but a single thin linen gown. Lady Eleanor's voice was as cold as a drawn blade. She commanded Elara never to think of crossing their threshold again, declaring that no one in this manor would ever speak her name. As Elara was shoved out into the freezing blizzard, she looked back one last time. Through the crack in the heavy wooden doors, a single ray of candlelight spilled from the grand hall Elara watched that flickering warmth dance in the snow until the heavy doors slammed shut. That was the last trace of warmth Elara would ever see from that house. Then Lady Eleanor sent a swift messenger to her son on his merchant caravan. It was a false, grim tidings, claiming that his wife had caught the sweating sickness and died, and that out of fear of the plague spreading, her body had already been burned to ashes. The footprints Elara left in the snow as she disappeared into the blizzard were quickly buried by the howling wind, leaving no trace behind. On that night, as the winter blizzard threatened to swallow the world whole, Elara walked barefoot through the deep snow. From the moment she was cast out of the rear gates, every time the soles of her feet touched the frozen earth, an agony, like flesh being torn away, shot up through her entire body. Gritting her teeth, she took one agonizing step after another. Her heavily pregnant belly felt as heavy as a millstone, pulling her forward with every step. Whenever the bitter wind howled, it whipped her thin linen gown until it flapped like loose parchment. The biting cold pierced straight through to her bones, making her tremble like a fragile leaf in a winter storm. Snow gathered heavy on her eyelashes, blinding her to the dark path ahead. Yet Elara did not stop walking. Her body knew all too well that to stop meant death. Not just for her, but for the innocent life growing inside her. How long had she walked? Deep within the dense, dark woods, her eyes caught the faint outline of a sagging roof through the gloom. It was a small, ruined forester hut, attached to an abandoned roadside shrine, long forgotten by the parish. The wooden door was half torn from its iron hinges, and inside, rotting straw and shards of broken clay pots lay scattered across. The frozen dirt floor. Elara crawled into the crumbling shelter, collapsing onto the earth. She gathered whatever rotting straw she could find, piling it beneath her, and leaned her back against the damp wooden wall. At that very moment, a violent, tearing agony ripped through her belly. Her time had come. In that desolate, freezing hut, with no midwife to tend to her and no hearth fire to boil water, Elara clutched the damp straw and bit down hard. She wanted to scream into the night, but terrified that wolves or wild boars might be drawn from the deep forest, she shoved the sleeve of her woolen gown into her mouth, swallowing her agony. Drenched in a cold sweat, her vision flashing white with unbearable pain, Elara delivered her own children with her bare, trembling hands. Before she could even catch her breath after the first cry, a second child followed. A son and a daughter, twins. With shaking hands, Elara gathered the newborns into her arms, fighting with every ounce of her, fading strength to keep them breathing. In the freezing night air, the cries of the two babes were so terribly weak that they were instantly swallowed by the roaring wind outside. She wrapped them together in her own damp gown, pulling their bare, fragile bodies tight against her chest to offer them the very last of her bodily warmth. But the mother holding them was already freezing. Her lips turned a bruised purple, and the feeling slowly vanished from her. Fingertips, one by one, Yet she never loosened her desperate embrace around her children. One night passed, then two. The blizzard outside the ruined shrine finally died down. But a far crueler trial awaited Elara. There was no food. She gritted her teeth and endured. But by the third day, her breast milk had dried up completely. The cries of the infants grew thinner and thinner until they lost even the strength to weep, their tiny mouths merely twitching in the cold air. Watching her son Rowan's lips turn a sickly white and her daughter Flora's breathing grew as faint as a spider silk, the tears dried up in Elara's eyes. Her body was so starved and drained that she could not even produce a single tear. She felt as if she were going mad. She clawed at her own chest, but no milk came. And outside was nothing but an endless expanse of white snow, offering no sustenance. As she watched the last traces of life draining from her children's faces, her mind went blank, and she felt something snap within her soul. In that instant, Elara brought the index finger of her left hand to her mouth. She bit down with such force that she thought her teeth might shatter. The flesh tore open, and dark, warm blood welled up from the wound. Elara, with a violently trembling right hand, guided her bleeding finger to her son Rowan's dry, pale lips. A single drop fell. Rowan's mouth twitched faintly. Elara immediately bit down on her thumb and let the blood drip into her daughter Flora's mouth. Having tasted their mother's blood, the infants began to take breathless gasps of air, and only then did Elara collapse, losing consciousness as she clutched them to her chest. For just 3 days only, Elara bit her own fingers to feed them. Every knuckle became scarred with overlapping teeth marks, the flesh torn and ragged. But when the blizzard finally passed, she sneaked out to the village edge. She stole fresh goat milk from farms and boiled a thin gruel from foraged roots and wild berries to feed her precious young, until the bitter winter passed and the spring thaw arrived. Elara kept her 2 children alive in that mountain hut, with stolen milk and silent tears. Meanwhile, in a distant market town, Lord Arthur, who was leading a large merchant caravan, received a sealed parchment. It bore grim tidings. It stated that his beloved wife, Elara, had contracted the sweating sickness and perished. And out of fear that the deadly plague would spread through the manor, her body had already been burned to ashes. As he read the letter, Arthur's hands shook like a leaf in a gale. His eyes widened in horror, his pupils losing their focus as all the strength vanished from his knees. He collapsed onto the muddy ground of the market square. Arthur abandoned everything. The costly silks, the silver coins, the merchant guild ledgers, none of it mattered. That very day, he mounted his horse and rode frantically toward his estate, whipping the beast day and night without a moment of rest. Arriving at the manor after days of relentless riding, Arthur did not even enter the great stone hall. He went straight up the hill behind the estate. The false grave that Lady Eleanor had prepared lay beneath an old, gnarled pine tree at the edge of the woods. A thin layer of fresh snow covered the small mound of earth, and a wooden cross bore Elara's name, carved with cruel precision. Arthur fell to his knees before that mound. For a long time, he sat there in absolute silence, staring blankly at the dirt. The winter wind shook the pine branches, scattering fine snow over his broad shoulders. But Arthur seemed completely numb to the cold. Then, as his hands absent-mindedly fumbled with his travel pack, his fingertips brushed against something soft. From the very bottom of his leather satchel, he pulled out a pair of worn, hand-woven shoes, crafted from rough wool and strands of dark hair. They were the very shoes Elara had stitched for him by the dim light of a tallow candle on the night before he left, weaving her own hair into the fabric. Stitch by stitch, Arthur lifted the shoes with both hands and brought them to his face. Through the coarse wool, the faint, familiar scent of Elara lingered. Arthur's face twisted in agony. He bit his lips so hard it bled, his jaw trembling violently, his eyes red and swollen. Finally, clutching the woven shoes tightly to his chest, he pressed his forehead against the freezing earth of the grave and burst into tears. It was a cry that sounded as if he were coughing up blood. The desperate, agonizing wail of a wounded beast echoed across the entire hill, startling a flock of crows from the pine branches and sending them scattering into the gray sky. From that day on, Arthur's spirit was utterly broken. When he opened his eyes in the morning, the first thing he sought was a flagon of strong ale, and when the sun set, he climbed the hill to the false grave. Weeping through the night until dawn, he refused to eat the bread and roasted meats brought to him, and his once strong, noble frame withered away until he was nothing but skin and bone. He could no longer read the ink on the guild ledgers, leaving the vast merchant affairs entirely in the hands of the manor stewards, while he locked himself away in his dark chamber. Lady Eleanor watched her son waste away, her heart burning with anxious dread. Yet she could not bring herself to speak the truth. To speak the truth meant confessing the unforgivable sin she had committed. Sister Margaret, on the other hand, watched her brother ruin without a single change in her expression. In the quiet of her own lavish chamber, a cold, the satisfied smile touched the corners of her lips. The seasons turned, and the following spring arrived. Having barely survived the brutal winter in the mountain hut, Elara dragged her painfully thin body down the forest path. She needed to forage for wild herbs and gather firewood to keep her children warm. Leaving the infants bundled in the ruined shrine made her footsteps feel as heavy as iron anvils, but she had to find food if they were to live. As she descended the ridge and neared the edge of the Lord estate, her feet suddenly stopped. Down below, beneath the old pine tree, she saw the back of a man dressed in dark mourning clothes, kneeling on the earth. The broad shoulders, shaking with grief before the grave mound, belonged to the man she missed more than anyone else in the world, her husband, Lord Arthur. Elara's heart dropped to her stomach. Her eyes widened, and her dry lips trembled uncontrollably. "He is alive. My lord has come back to find me." The thought brought a sudden, overwhelming flood of tears to her eyes. She wanted to run down that hill right then and there and throw her arms around his back. Elara took a desperate step forward, but in that exact moment, she caught sight of her own reflection in a muddy puddle left by the spring rain. Her hair was a tangled, matted mess, falling wildly down her back. Her cheeks were deeply hollowed, her cheekbones jutting out like a skeleton. Her once clean linen gown was now a foul, yellowed rag stained with dried blood. And thick mud, and her bare feet were covered in dark scabs and the ugly, blackened scars of frostbite. Elara stood frozen, staring down at her wretched face in the muddy water for a long time. Then the cruel voice of her mother-in-law echoed in her ears like a curse. "You filthy, low-born wench, carrying a cursed seed! How dare a peasant taint the noble bloodline of this house?" That cold, sharp voice struck her like a physical blow. It felt as though a heavy stone had been placed upon Elara's chest. What will happen if I show myself to him looking like this? Her mind spun with terrifying thoughts. If the village gossip spread that the low-born wife was still alive, the proud reputation of Lady Eleanor, who had sent the false tidings of death, would be completely destroyed. And that disgrace would fall directly onto her husband's shoulders. In a kingdom where a noble family honor was valued more than life itself, the sudden return of a banished, beggar-like peasant wife would turn Lord Arthur into a laughingstock among the lords and knights for the rest of his days. Elara slowly pulled back the foot she had stepped forward. She clenched her fists so tightly, her nails dug into her palms, and she bit her lip until the flesh broke and blood seeped into her mouth. Tears streamed down her hollow cheeks, but she made no sound. She forced down the wailing cry that rose in her throat until she thought her chest would burst open. Elara stood there for a long time, simply watching her husband's back. The image of Arthur pressing his forehead to the dirt mound, his shoulders heaving with sorrow, was burned deeply into her eyes. He is weeping. He is weeping so bitterly because of me. The thought carved into her heart like a rusted blade. Yet Elara turned away. Dragging her trembling, exhausted legs, she retraced her steps back up the steep mountain path. With every step she took, the sound of her husband's agonizing sobs was carried to her ears by the spring wind, and with every sound her narrow shoulders flinched and shook. Dozens of times she fought the desperate urge to stop and look back, but in the end, Elara never turned her head until her frail, ragged figure disappeared from sight. Completely into the dense pine forest, Arthur remained completely unaware that his wife had been standing just a few paces behind him. It was a cruel twist of fate, making them the most distant strangers in the world even when they were close enough to touch. Elara returned to the ruined shrine and gathered her children into her arms. Rowan and Flora reached up with their tiny hands to touch their mother's face, but the tears on Elara's cheeks would not stop flowing. She pressed her bleeding lips to her children's foreheads and whispered softly into the cold air, "Because I have you, I must live. Because I have you, I must endure." Her voice sounded like a desperate vow to herself, and at the same time, a pleading prayer to the heavens. The spring breeze seeped through the cracks of the ruined door, and Elara spent the entire night wide awake, holding her children tightly against her chest. And so began Elara's long, harrowing survival in the wild mountains. Every single day was a brutal war, digging up tough roots, gathering fallen acorns, and wetting her dry throat with freezing water from the mountain stream. And down in the grand stone manor, the shadows in Lady Eleanor's eyes grew deeper, as she watched her only son drown himself in ale and despair. It would be 5 long, unforgiving years before the tangled threads of this cruel fate would finally begin to unravel. 5 years was a truly long and merciless time. For Elara, raising 2 children in a ruined forest hut, the day began long before the sun ever rose over the horizon. In the pitch-black hours of the morning, before the children woke, she would leave the hut and climb the steep, rocky slopes to dig for roots. In the spring, she gathered bitter greens and wild garlic. In the summer, she clawed deep into the earth for arrowroot. In the autumn, she scoured the forest floor for acorns and fallen chestnuts. When the harsh winter returned, she smashed the thick ice of the frozen stream to draw water and gather dead branches to build a small, smoky fire on the dirt floor. Digging for roots in the frozen, rocky soil with her bare hands caused her fingernails to rip away one by one. Her fingers, severely frostbitten during that first brutal winter, grew thick and misshapen, the skin cracking and peeling. Her hands had grown as rough and cracked as the delicate fingers that had once stitched wild blooms onto scraps of linen so beautifully they seemed to breathe, had been ruined beyond recognition over the past 5 years. Yet Elara never abandoned her needlework. With hands calloused from the forest dirt, she gripped her bone needle, gritting her teeth as she forced it through the coarse hemp, stitch by agonizing stitch. The pattern of intertwined wild blooms lacked its former elegance. It was crooked, and the blood that seeped from her cracked fingers left dark stains across the fabric. Elara gathered these small, stained pouches, carried them down the mountain, and sold them in the dark corners of the muddy market square for a few copper pennies to buy salt and a handful of oats. The children grew wild and free, like the creatures of the woods. By his 5th winter, young Rowan could run along the steep, rocky paths with ease, while his sister, Flora, taking after her mother, sat with her small hands weaving blades of grass into little crowns. The only thing Elara could offer them was a thin bowl of gruel boiled from foraged roots, yet the children would smile and tell her it was a feast. To Elara, those smiles were worth more than all the gold in the king's treasury. She had never once taken off the silver ring Lord Arthur had given her when they exchanged their vows. But as the years of starvation left her fingers thin and bony, the ring constantly slipped from her hand. Terrified of losing it in the snow, Elara strung the silver ring onto a thick leather cord and tied it securely around Rowan's neck. "This was given to your mother by your father," she told him. "You must never, ever lose it." Rowan nodded earnestly, clutching the ring with both hands. From that day on, he never took it off, not even when he slept. When their 5th winter descended upon the forest, the very thing she feared most came to pass. In the dead of night, Rowan grew as hot as a hearth fire, his small body trembling violently as he began to mutter in a feverish delirium. When Elara touched his forehead, the heat burned her palm. His eyes were unfocused. He could no longer even recognize his mother's face. Elara soaked a rag in the freezing stream and placed it on the boy's head, but the fever showed no signs of breaking. The moment the sun rose, Elara strapped Rowan to her back and began the perilous descent down the mountain. Carrying a 5-year-old child down the icy, treacherous path with nothing but skin and bones for her own strength was a gamble with death. When her feet slipped and she fell, she dragged herself back up. Even when her knees bled, she gritted her teeth and never stopped walking. She pounded on the heavy wooden door of the apothecary near the market square. The old healer examined the boy and shook his head gravely. "The winter fever has taken deep root," he said. "He needs a potent draught brewed with imported resins and ground staghorn immediately. But the cost is steep." When Elara asked the price, the sum he named was more silver than she could earn in a year of selling mountain roots. The apothecary cast a disdainful look over Elara's ragged, beggar-like appearance. He muttered that if she had no coin, there was nothing he could do, and turned his back on her. Elara collapsed on the stone step outside the door, listening to the ragged, shallow breathing of the child strapped to her back. Rowan's unnatural heat was burning right through her thin wool dress. She sat there with her head bowed for a long time, until her hand slowly moved to the nape of her neck. Though tangled and unbrushed for 5 years, her hair still fell in a thick, heavy mane down her back. To a woman of the realm, her hair was as precious as her life and honor. With trembling legs, Elara stood up and dragged herself through the market alleys until she found a traveling merchant sitting behind his wooden cart. Standing before him, Elara could not speak for a long time. Her fingertips shook and her lips quivered. Finally, she pulled her tangled mane over her shoulder and spoke in a low, broken whisper. "Buy this from me, I beg of you." The merchant felt the weight of her hair and tilted his head. He told her it was heavily matted and would not fetch a high price. Keeping her head bowed, Elara pleaded once more, telling him she would take whatever copper he could spare. The merchant took out his heavy iron shears and began to cut. Handful by handful, the dark locks fell, piling up like a shadow on the merchant's wooden cart. When the final strand was severed, Elara's hair was left jagged and shorn close to her ears. Clutching the meager handful of pennies the merchant gave her, Elara ran blindly back to the apothecary. It was nowhere near the asking price. But after begging on her hands and knees, the healer finally handed over a single pouch of the brewed medicine. Elara poured the bitter draught into her dying boy's mouth, drop by drop. She did not sleep a wink that night, keeping her hand pressed to Rowan's forehead. Only when the pale dawn broke did the fierce heat finally begin to subside. When Rowan opened his weary eyes and recognized his mother, Elara pulled him into her arms and wept without a sound. At that exact moment, On the other side of the muddy market square, a man stumbling blindly in a drunken stupor wandered through the back alleys. There was no trace left of the confident, wealthy merchant heir Lord Arthur had once been. His cheeks were hollow, his cheekbones jutted out sharply, and deep, dark shadows hung beneath his eyes. His beard was overgrown and unkempt, and his fine wool tunic was stained with spilled ale and street dirt. Ever since he lost his wife 5 years ago, Arthur had not gone a single day without a cup of ale in his hand. When he opened his eyes in the morning, Elara's face haunted him. When he fell asleep at night, he heard her voice. The bitter regret of not holding her one last time. The agonizing guilt of leaving her to join the merchant caravan. It pierced him to the bone, making the very act of breathing a torment. As he stumbled through the alley, Arthur's gaze suddenly locked onto a small object. There, resting on a peddler's weathered wooden stall, was a frayed linen pouch. The embroidered crest upon it brought Arthur to a dead halt. It was a pattern of 2 wild blooms, their stems intertwined. Arthur's eyes trembled wildly. This specific crest, this exact way of stitching, could only be born from the fingertips of one person in the entire world. Elara. But the embroidery was different from before. The stitches were uneven. The thread had gone astray in several places. And above all, what made Arthur's breath catch in his throat were the dark, rust-colored stains speckled across the linen. It was dried blood, spilled from cracked fingertips forced to grip a needle. Arthur's hands shook violently. He picked up the pouch and brought it to his face. Beneath the smell of dirt and coarse hemp, a faint, deeply familiar scent lingered. Even after 5 years, he could never forget the scent of his wife. His heart began to pound against his ribs like a war drum. He grabbed the peddler by the collar of his tunic and demanded to know who had brought it to him. The peddler's eyes went wide with terror as he stammered out his answer. It was just this morning, my lord. A beggar woman sold it to me." Her hair was hacked off unevenly. Her face was covered in soot, and she was carrying a young child on her back. All the blood drained from Arthur's face. His legs gave way, and he had to grip the wooden cart just to keep from collapsing. Dead. They told him she was dead of the winter plague. They told him they had burned her body to stop the spread. But she was alive and carrying a child? Whose child could it be? In an instant, everything Arthur had believed for the past 5 years shattered into dust. The tragic news his mother had sent, the empty grave on the Manor hill, his 5 years of endless mourning, it was all a foundation built on grotesque lies. The moment the truth hit him, his knees buckled, and he collapsed right in the middle of the muddy market square. He clutched his chest, gasping for air as his vision turned red and the world spun violently around him. He was being torn to shreds, caught between a rage that made his blood boil backward and the crushing, sickening guilt that he had abandoned his wife in a living hell for 5 years. That night, under the pale moonlight, Arthur stood alone by the cold river that flowed just beyond the town's stone walls. The moonlight stretched long, dark across the rushing water, and the biting wind whipped at his loose, stained tunic. From inside his coat, Arthur pulled out the worn leather shoes Elara had once worn, pressing them tightly against his heart. "Forgive me. Forgive me for failing to protect you," he whispered into the dark. Tears streaming down his hollow cheeks, he took off his own boots and placed them neatly on the muddy bank. Barefoot, he took a step into the freezing river. The icy water swallowed his ankles, then his knees, then rose to his waist. But Arthur did not stop. The current pushed fiercely against his body, and the smooth river stones slipped beneath his feet. Just as the black water reached his chest, the frantic sound of boots pounding against the mud echoed behind him. With a heavy splash, a pair of arms wrapped desperately around Arthur's waist. My lord, please, you must not do this. It was old Barnaby." The Lord's loyal servant. His hair was completely white, and he was soaked to the bone as he dragged Arthur backward toward the muddy bank. Arthur thrashed and fought, but the old man held on with the strength of a desperate soul. The two men collapsed side by side in the cold mud. Covered in filth, Arthur stared up at the dark sky and howled in agony. "How can I live? With what face can I go on breathing?" Barnaby fell to his knees beside him, pressing his forehead so hard into the mud that it bruised, and began to weep. The old servant's shoulders heaved uncontrollably as a wail burst from his throat. "My lord, this old fool has buried a terrible sin in his heart for 5 long years. I beg of you, please hear me just this once." Arthur slowly turned his head to look at Barnaby. Tears were streaming freely down the old man's deeply wrinkled face. His voice shook violently as he began to speak. "5 years ago, on that dreadful night, I was walking past the stables. I saw it with my own eyes. I saw Sister Margaret's maid slipping a heavy purse of silver coins to a gang of cutthroats in the dark alley." Arthur's eyes widened in shock. And after that, Barnaby choked out, "I saw Lady Eleanor searching the young mistress's sewing box in the great hall. And that very night, I watched them drag the young mistress out through the servants' gate and cast her into the snow. I saw it all." Barnaby's voice cracked, turning into a wretched sob. "I was terrified. I am nothing but a lowly servant. How could I dare speak against the lady of the manor? So I kept my mouth shut. But for 5 years, every night, the young mistress's cries have never left my ears." Arthur bolted upright on the muddy riverbank. Freezing water dripped heavily from his clothes, but he did not feel the cold. The veins in his eyes bulged, and he clenched his jaw so hard the bone popped. The suffocating sorrow that had crushed him for 5 years instantly mutated into a roaring, uncontrollable inferno of absolute rage. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. It wasn't just his mother's doing. His sister, Margaret, had woven the treacherous snare, and his mother had eagerly sprung the trap. Arthur clenched his fists. His fingernails dug so deeply into his palms, blood began to seep out, but he felt no pain. The wrath boiling through his veins left no room for physical agony. Standing in the pitch-black night, he ground his teeth together and made a vow to the shadows. I will find them. I will find my wife and my child, no matter what it takes. His voice was low, but it was harder and more unyielding than the rushing river. For the first time in 5 years, a living, dangerous fire burned in the eyes of the broken man. The moment the sun crested the horizon, Arthur began to move. The hand that had spent 5 years clutching a flagon of ale now tightly fastened his damp cloak. His gaze was entirely transformed. His bloodshot eyes blazed with a terrifying red fire, fueled by 5 years of agonizing regret and pure, unadulterated fury. Arthur began tearing through the town, starting from the muddy market square. Beyond the manor walls, he scoured the weaver's alley, the apothecary lane, the beggar's row, and every narrow cobblestone street a person could possibly walk through. He grabbed every merchant at their stalls, demanding if they had seen a woman with roughly shorn hair, carrying a child on her back. Most shook their heads. A few muttered that they had seen such a beggar, but had no idea where she had gone. One day passed, then 2. On the dawn of the 3rd day, Arthur was back on the streets before the roosters even crowed. Blisters formed on the soles of his feet, bursting and bleeding through his damp boots. But he never stopped walking. His wife had walked barefoot through the freezing mountains for 5 years. He would not allow himself to rest. The thought that mere blisters were nothing but a trifling nuisance hurried his steps onward. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Arthur ventured deep into the beggar's row, a wretched alleyway nestled just beyond the southern walls of the town. It was a narrow, muddy lane where crumbling timber cottages leaned heavily against one another. There, at the very end of the alley, his eyes fell upon a small child crouching on the damp earth, laying out little bundles of gathered herbs. It was a young boy, no more than 5 years of age. His face was smeared with dark hearth soot, and he wore frayed rags that could scarcely be called a tunic. Yet, the way the boy bowed his little head to the passing townsfolk, politely asking them to buy his herbs for a copper penny, was so remarkably dignified that Arthur found himself stopping in his tracks, without even realizing it. But in that very moment, Arthur's gaze froze on the boy's neck. Strung upon a frayed linen thread, something metallic had slipped halfway out from the collar of the child's ragged shirt. Arthur took a slow step closer, narrowing his eyes, though it was tarnished and had lost its bright luster. The round edge and the heavy, crude hammer marks on the inner band were unmistakably clear. It was a silver ring. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. He felt his heart skip a heavy beat, and his eyes slowly widened in disbelief. Reaching out with a trembling hand, he gently lifted the ring from the boy's chest and rested it upon his own palm. As he rubbed his thumb along the inner curve of the metal, the distinct strike marks of the village blacksmith revealed themselves beneath the tarnish. There was absolutely no mistake. It was the very same silver coin he had melted down and commissioned from the smith in the market square. It was the exact ring he had slipped onto Elara's finger beneath the light of the full moon, begging her to stay by his side for the rest of his days. Arthur's fingertips began to tremble like autumn leaves in the wind. He gripped the ring so tightly that his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The rims of his eyes burned red, and his vision blurred with sudden tears. And in that precise moment, an urgent, desperate woman's voice echoed from the far end of the alley. "Rowan! Flora! Where are you?" It felt as though a bolt of lightning had struck straight through Arthur's body. That voice, the one he had heard in his waking nightmares for 5 long years, the tone he could never forget, even in his deepest dreams, was now echoing through the muddy lane. Arthur slowly turned his head. Coming around the corner of the alley, he saw the figure of a woman running frantically toward them. Her hair had been shorn roughly right up to her ears, and her cheeks were so deeply hollowed that her cheekbones jutted out like sharp stones. Her wool dress was so caked in yellowed mud and grime that its original color was entirely lost to the world, and beneath the frayed hem of her skirt, her bare feet were covered in dark scabs and the blackened scars of severe frostbite. Her body was reduced to mere skin and bones, looking so fragile that a gust of winter wind might snap her in two. It was Elara. Arthur's mouth fell half open, unable to exhale or draw in a single breath. He stood frozen to the earth like a stone statue. Elara, too, stopped dead in her tracks. She had been running wildly in search of her children. But the moment she saw the face of the man standing in the middle of the alley, all the strength vanished from her legs, rooting her to the spot. Only a narrow stretch of the muddy lane lay between them. It was a distance of barely 10 paces, yet that space felt as vast and insurmountable as the 5 bitter years that had kept them apart. Elara's eyes slowly widened. Her pale lips began to quiver, and soon her entire jaw was trembling. She blinked rapidly, as if unable to believe her own sight. But the man standing before her did not vanish like a forest phantom. Even though his cheeks were sunken and a rough, unkempt beard covered his jaw, it was undeniably him. It was the man she loved more than anyone else in the world. Arthur took a single halting step forward, and then another. His legs shook so violently that he could barely keep his balance. Yet he forced himself to walk toward Elara. But Elara took a step back. Her body retreated of its own accord. The same crushing shame she had felt 5 years ago when she had looked at her own wretched reflection in a freezing puddle and turned away, now pressed down heavily upon her soul. How could I ever stand before my Lord looking like this? The agonizing thought that a low-born woman like her should not return from the dead, only to bring ruin and disgrace upon him, held her feet captive. But just as Elara moved to turn and flee, Arthur lunged forward. Stumbling over the uneven cobblestones, he threw his arms wide and pulled her into a desperate, crushing embrace. Elara's sharp, fleshless shoulder blades pressed hard against Arthur's chest. Her body, stripped of everything but bone, was so terrifyingly light that the moment his arms wrapped around her back, he could feel every single one of her ribs beneath his fingertips. Arthur's face twisted in sheer agony. He clamped his jaw shut, but his nose flushed a deep, stinging red, and heavy, thick tears began to pour from his eyes, dropping onto her ragged cloak. He could not speak a single word. The apologies he owed her, the desperate confessions of how much he had missed her, all tangled together in his throat and refused to come out. All he could do was tighten his grip, holding Elara closer and closer against, his heart as if trying to shield her from the world itself. Elara was weeping as well. At first, she made no sound, only her frail shoulders shaking against him. But soon, as if a dam had finally broken, she threw her head back and began to wail. It was as though all the bitter tears she had swallowed down over the past 5 winters were pouring out of her all at once. The tradesmen and peasants passing through the alley stopped and stared at the two of them. But neither Arthur nor Elara saw anyone else. They were entirely blind to the world around them. Only the sound of their raw, animalistic sobbing filled the narrow, muddy lane as they clung to one another in the dirt. How much time passed in that alley? Arthur gently gripped Elara's shoulders and took a half step back to look upon his wife's face. Heavy tear stains streaked the dirt across her hollowed cheeks, and ragged breaths slipped through her cracked and bleeding lips. Arthur's tear-filled gaze slowly moved down to Elara's hands. Those beautiful, delicate hands which had once been able to stitch a wild meadow flower onto linen so perfectly that it seemed to bloom and breathe, were now ruined beyond all recognition. Every knuckle was swollen and twisted from the brutal frost. Where her fingernails had rotted and fallen away, rough, uneven patches of scarred flesh had grown in their place. And on her index finger and thumb, the very fingers she had bitten to draw blood to feed her starving babes, layers upon layers of deep teeth marks were scarred into the skin, leaving the flesh cracked and hardened like the rough bark of an old oak tree. Arthur took those broken hands and wrapped them gently within his own, as his trembling fingertips brushed over every scar and every a jagged wound, the unimaginable agony those hands had endured for 5 years seemed to travel straight through his touch and pierce his very heart. A sound like a dying man's groan escaped Arthur's lips. "Forgive me. Oh, please forgive me. Have mercy on this wretched fool." Elara shook her head, gripping her husband's hands as tightly as her ruined fingers would allow. It was not my lord's fault. It was never my lord's doing. Their joined hands trembled together in the cold air for a very long time. The very next morning broke with a cold gray dawn. Arthur held the hand of Elara, who still looked little more than a walking corpse, in his left hand, and with his right he firmly gripped the trembling hands of his 5-year-old twins. Arthur's face still bore the faint tracks of his tears from the night before, but his eyes were now as cold and unyielding as the sharpened steel of a knight's broadsword. His strides toward the grand manor estate held not a single ounce of hesitation. Standing before the massive, iron-bound oak doors of his family's manor hall, Arthur did not pause for even a breath. He raised his heavy boot and kicked the Heavy timber doors wide open with a deafening crash. At the thunderous noise, the manor guards and servants in the courtyard flinched in terror and scrambled backward. Seated at the high table in the great hall, breaking their morning fast with fine bread and roasted meats, Lady Eleanor and his sister Margaret both snapped their heads toward the entrance. When Lady Eleanor saw Arthur standing in the doorway, flanked by a skeletal, ragged woman and two filthy small children, the silver spoon slipped from her, grasped and clattered violently against the stone floor. The sharp, ringing sound echoed through the deathly silent hall. Every drop of blood drained instantly from Margaret's face. The peasant woman she had thrown into the raging winter blizzard 5 years ago, the woman she was utterly certain had died in the snow, was standing alive inside the manor walls. For a moment, Margaret felt as though her lungs had stopped working, but she quickly gritted her teeth, summoning every ounce of her venomous pride. She knew that if she faltered now, every wicked lie she had spun would be dragged into the light. Margaret leaped from her carved wooden chair and raised her voice to a shrill scream. "Arthur, have you lost your wits? You dare bring this filthy witch and some other man's bastard whelps into our sacred hall to mock our noble house?" Margaret's shrieks echoed across the courtyard, but Arthur did not even blink. He merely cast a gaze as cold as a winter grave upon his sister and refused to speak a single word in reply. In heavy silence, Arthur stepped forward and gently guided the children from behind his back, making them stand directly before Lady Eleanor and Margaret. Rowan and Flora, terrified by the grand, imposing stone walls and the angry shouts, clung tightly to the folds of Elara's ragged skirt, keeping their little heads bowed. Arthur walked over to a wooden basin of fresh water near the hearth, dipped a clean linen cloth into it, and wrung it out. He then knelt on the cold stone floor, bringing himself down to the children's eye level. With immense tenderness, he began to wipe away the dark hearth soot and thick layers of street grime from little Rowan's face, stroke by slow stroke. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the great hall. As the servants and guards held their breath and watched, the boy's true face began to emerge from beneath the filth. Lady Eleanor's eyes bulged from her skull as the boy's pale cheeks were revealed, then the bridge of his nose, and finally his brow. Her mouth fell wider and wider open in absolute horror. When Arthur finished wiping clean little Flora's face as well, and stood the two, children side by side, the gaze of every single soul in the hall was completely transfixed upon their faces. The silence was so profound that not even the sound of breathing could be heard. The faces of the two children were of terrifyingly perfect reflection of Arthur's own face from his childhood. The very same face Lady Eleanor had cherished and worshipped above all else. They had the exact same slight droop at the corners of their eyes. They had the exact same high, noble bridge of the nose. Even the tiny, faint mole resting just below the right side of their lips was entirely identical. It was as if God himself had plucked Arthur's boyhood visage from the past and split it perfectly into two living souls. Before those faces, no wicked lie, no venomous accusation, and no false witness could stand. Even if a person had 10 mouths, they could not deny the truth. It was the undeniable proof of blood, the very lineage of their noble house. But staring back at them, Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. Stripped of all her wicked words, her face turned as white as bleached parchment. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she had to desperately grab hold of a thick oak pillar just to keep herself from collapsing. But she could not hide the violent, wretched trembling that seized her entire body. Lady Eleanor could not tear her eyes away from the children, with her eyes practically bursting from her head. She looked frantically back and forth between their small faces. She saw the drooping eyes. She saw the high nose. She saw the tiny mole by the lip. The longer she stared, the more she saw her son, and the more she saw her own flesh and blood. These ragged, starving children were the heirs to the manor, the very grandchildren she had been so utterly desperate to secure for the survival of their noble name. And she, with her own 2 hands, had thrown them out into the black, howling blizzard, still resting inside the womb of her heavily pregnant daughter-in-law, abandoning them to be devoured by the wolves of the winter mountains. Lady Eleanor's proud, unyielding face slowly began to contort. Her lips quivered violently, her jaw shuddered, and her stiff, aristocratic shoulders, which she had held high her entire life, began to sink, inch by inch. Everyone in the hall could see the strength utterly draining from her knees. The great mistress of the house, a woman who had lived her entire life with her spine stiffened by the pride and arrogance of nobility, slowly stepped down from the raised stone dais. With every step she took, her legs wobbled and swayed. And the very moment her fine leather shoes touched the dirt of the courtyard floor, her knees buckled completely and she collapsed in a heap. It was the first time since the day she was born that Lady Eleanor's knees had ever touched the filthy earth. Slumped in the dirt, the old lady reached out with 2 violently shaking hands and grabbed hold of Elara's ruined, scarred hands. She pulled her daughter-in-law's frost-bitten hands, covered in thick calluses and cracked flesh, straight to her own pale cheeks. The proud lady rubbed her face desperately against the rough, scarred back of Elara's hands as a torrent of bitter tears finally erupted from her eyes. "I was wrong. I raised my own daughter wrong." Her voice was a hoarse, shattering wail. "May the Lord strike me down with heaven's wrath. Forgive me, oh, please forgive me." Lady Eleanor's agonizing cries echoed off the high stone walls of the manor estate. The sight of the great lady who had armored herself in the strict laws and vanity of the nobility for her entire life, kneeling in the mud and weeping with such wretched despair, felt like an iron nail being driven straight through the hearts of every soul who stood there watching. Elara stood in silence for a long time, looking down at her mother-in-law's trembling shoulders. This was a woman she had every right to despise with all her soul. This was the master of that cold, merciless voice that had cast her out into the raging blizzard 5 winters ago. Yet warm tears began to spill from Elara's eyes as well. Slowly, the peasant woman sank to her knees in the dirt, bringing herself down to the exact same level as the noble lady. With her frost-ruined hands, she gently and carefully began to stroke Lady Eleanor's trembling back, right there in the center of the manor courtyard. The low-born daughter-in-law and the proud mother-in-law knelt facing one another, weeping into the cold morning air as the pale winter sun quietly rose above the estate walls. Even long after the sound of their crying had finally quieted, not a single person in the hall dared to speak a word. From that day on, the truth burst forth like a broken dam, impossible to hold back. The old servant, Barnaby, went before the magistrate at the sheriff court and confessed every dark deed that had transpired 5 winters ago. How Margaret's manservant had handed silver pennies to the market ruffians. How the forged parchment and a lover's token had been hidden in Elara's sewing basket. How Lady Eleanor had driven her heavily pregnant daughter-in-law into the howling blizzard, and how the false tidings of her death by winter fever had been sent to Arthur. Not a single shadow was left unexposed. The manservant was dragged before the magistrate and wept, confessing he had only followed Margaret's wicked commands. When the full, twisted tapestry of this cruel plot was laid bare beneath the light of day, the lords, commoners, and guild masters of the city were struck with absolute horror. Margaret was branded the ultimate sinner of the noble house. Whispers spread like wildfire among the merchants in the muddy market square, and sharp fingers of scorn were pointed by every noble family in the realm. Arthur could not even bear to look upon his sister's face. The realization that the woman he once called sister was the very monster had driven his wife and unborn blood into the jaws of death, turned his fury into a deep, sickening revulsion. Margaret was banished from the great stone manor. As she stepped out into the cold street, the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her, echoing with a resounding thud. It was the sound of all her ties to the noble house being severed forever. She was sent away like discarded rubbish to an abandoned, ruined hunting lodge deep in the isolated northern woods. Surrounded by nothing but dark pines and jagged hills, the lodge saw no visitors. The proud Margaret, who had once draped herself in fine wool and velvet cloaks, who had commanded servants and flaunted her noble status, was now reduced to sitting alone in the damp corner of a crumbling stone room, staring blankly at the rotting walls. By day, the wind howling through the empty courtyard filled her ears, and by night, the terrifying cries of forest beasts echoed through the darkness. After a month of hearing no human voice, Margaret's mind and body began to shatter. A fiery tightness gripped her chest, growing worse with each passing day, choking the breath from her lungs. She could not stomach even the hardest crust of bread, causing her cheeks to hollow out into gaunt shadows. Sleepless nights painted dark, bruised rings beneath her eyes. Then came the day when she coughed, and heavy, Bright red drops of blood splattered across her pale palms. The sickness of a broken, bitter spirit had taken deep root in her lungs. Lying on a bed of rotting straw in the freezing room, Margaret stared up at the spiderwebs clinging to the rafters and thought of the past. She remembered the twisted thrill she felt when she planted the forged parchment in her sister-in-law's sewing basket. She remembered hiding behind the manor pillars, the corners of her mouth curling into a cruel smile as her mother cast the weeping Elara out into the snow. The past 5 years flashed before her eyes. Years she had spent watching Arthur weep before the empty, candlelit chapel, without ever changing her cold expression. Why had she felt such triumph then? Looking back now, she could not fathom what that dark satisfaction had even been. Was it pure jealousy? Was it blind rage? Or was it the twisted, pathetic obsession that because her own marriage had failed, others must be dragged down into misery alongside her? Finding no answers, Margaret could only cough into the freezing air. As the bloody fits grew more frequent, she became entirely bedridden. There was no one to bake her bread, no apothecary to brew her medicine, no gentle hand to feel her fevered brow. The hearth fire had died long ago, and the stone floor was as cold as a grave. Margaret pulled her thin, ragged blanket up to her chin, curling into a tight ball as she gasped for breath. Just as the dark thought that she would die alone in this wretched place filled her mind, a faint sound came from beyond the heavy wooden door. Margaret strained her ears. Footsteps drew closer, and the rusted hinges creaked open. The sudden winter sunlight blinded her, and she squinted. A figure stepped quietly into the room, her face slowly revealed against the harsh light. It was Elara. Margaret's eyes widened in sheer terror. She felt her heart plummet to the cold stone floor. Why? Why was this woman here? Her mind went entirely blank. Elara stepped into the room without a single word. In her hands, she carried something carefully wrapped in a linen cloth. When she pulled the cloth back, a small clay crock was revealed. A rich, sweet, and comforting aroma rose into the freezing air. It was warm, spiced honey and oat porridge. It was the exact same porridge Margaret used to demand constantly, back when she lived in luxury at the manor. In the bitter depths of winter, she would always harass the kitchen maids, demanding a bowl of that sweet, steaming porridge be brought to her chambers. Elara had remembered. Carefully, Elara set the clay crock down near Margaret's head. Then she gently rolled up a spare blanket and placed it behind Margaret's back, helping the sickly, trembling woman to sit up. Margaret looked up into Elara's face. There was no hatred, no resentment, and no fury in the peasant woman's eyes. Through the deep lines and frost-ruined scars carved by 5 years of surviving near death in the wild, only a calm, quiet, and profound stillness looked back at her. Elara did not speak. She did not ask why Margaret had done such evil. She did not say she forgave her, nor did she offer words of pity. She simply pushed the warm clay crock a little closer to Margaret and went to sit quietly in the corner of the room. Margaret's gaze fell upon the porridge. The white steam rising from the golden oats gently brushed against her hollow, freezing cheeks. That simple warmth touched something buried deep within her shattered soul. Her pale lips began to tremble. Her chin quivered, and the tip of her nose flushed a deep, painful red. Moisture welled up in her sunken eyes, and a single scalding tear rolled down her cheek. With violently shaking hands, Margaret pulled the warm clay crock to her chest. The moment the heat seeped into her freezing palms, a low, agonizing moan escaped her lips. At first, it was just a fragile whimper, but soon her shoulders heaved, and it broke into a wretched, gut-wrenching wail. They were the first tears of true repentance she had ever shed in her life. The unbearable weight of what she had done, of the horrific suffering this innocent woman had endured because of her malice, finally sank deep into her heart, carried by the simple warmth of the porridge. Clutching the clay crock to her chest, Margaret bowed her head and wept bitterly for a long, long time. Sitting in the corner, Elara listened to the broken woman's cries in utter silence. Outside the window, the winter birds chirped, and the pale sunlight stretched long across the ruined courtyard. Elara did not leave the cold room until Margaret's weeping finally faded into quiet, exhausted breaths. Meanwhile, back at the great stone manor in the capital, Arthur had made a monumental decision. The ledger books of the generations-old merchant guild, the control over the vast trade routes, the towering stone estate with its grand halls, and every piece of silver and gold within it, Arthur turned his back on all the immense wealth and power of his noble bloodline. Lady Eleanor wept bitterly, begging him to stay, but his mind was set in stone. He could not bear to remain a single day longer in the house that had condemned his wife and children to hell for 5 long years. He could never rebuild his family beneath a roof built on false honor, cruelty, and aristocratic hypocrisy. Arthur liquidated his ties to the estate without a shred of hesitation. He left just enough silver for his mother to live out her final years without starving, and distributed the rest of his wealth among the guild workers and the loyal, long-suffering servants. To the old servant, Barnaby, Arthur handed a heavy leather purse filled with silver coins and bowed his head deeply. If not for you, my life would have ended at the bottom of the freezing river. I shall never forget my debt to you until the end of my days. Barnaby pressed his hands together, bowing until his forehead nearly touched the cobblestones, praying that only paths of blooming flowers would lay ahead for the young lord and his lady, leaving the cruel, cold capital behind. Arthur and Elara took to the road, heading far south. They found their new home in a bright coastal village by the southern sea, where the waters were crystal clear and the ocean breeze blew warm and gentle. In a modest corner of the village market, the couple opened a small cloth stall, starting their lives over from nothing. Arthur never once cared about the social standing of his customers, treating commoner and knight alike with warmth. Elara, though her hands were scarred and mangled by the frostbite of the wilderness, sat by the stall painstakingly stitching linen coifs, wool cloaks, and scented herb pouches. Her pouches, embroidered with the delicate intertwined image of two wild forest flowers, soon became the talk of the coastal town. Travelers and merchants came from afar just to buy them. People said that looking at the slightly crooked but deeply devoted needlework brought a strange, comforting warmth to their hearts. Rowan and Flora, the twins, ran through the muddy market lanes, laughing and playing with the other village children. Whenever Elara watched her children, who had once lived like hunted beasts in a freezing mountain cave, running freely and laughing under the bright sun, she would secretly wipe away tears behind her wooden stall. They were not tears of sorrow, but tears of overwhelming relief that her children could finally live as human beings. The seasons turned, and a full year passed in peace. It was a clear, radiant spring day. Arthur and Elara sat side by side on a grassy cliff that overlooked the vast, sparkling southern sea. The warm ocean breeze gently played with Elara's hair. Down in the green meadow below the cliff, 6-year-old Rowan and Flora were running wild. After playing for a long time, the children began to pick the wildflowers, blooming in the tall grass. With their small, clumsy hands, they gathered a handful of yellow dandelions, purple violets, and white meadow blossoms, and ran up the hill toward their parents. Rowan and Flora clumsily wove the green stems together, tying them into tiny, fragile circles. They crouched down in front of Arthur. Rowan reached out and slid a tiny ring made of wildflowers onto Arthur's thick, calloused finger. The flower ring was so delicate, it looked as though it would crush easily. But the warmth radiating from the child's fingertips was more precious than any kingly treasure. Rowan looked up into Arthur's face and beamed with a bright, innocent smile. Father. It was the very first time in his 6 years of life that the boy had ever spoken that word. Flora, too, slid a tiny flower ring onto Arthur's other finger and echoed her brother, Father. The sweet voices of the two children were carried by the sea breeze, echoing softly across the grassy cliff. Arthur's face slowly crumpled. He bit his lip hard, but his chin trembled violently, and the tip of his nose turned bright red. He tried to hold it back, but it was impossible. Heavy, thick tears spilled from his eyes, dropping softly onto the fragile flower rings his children had given him. Arthur pulled both children into a desperate, crushing embrace. The small, warm bodies of the children he had not been able to hold for 5 agonizing years now moved safely within his arms. The steady, rhythmic beating of their little hearts echoed deeply against his own chest. Sitting beside them, Elara watched her family, her scarred hands resting peacefully in her lap. The warm spring sunlight gently kissed her frost-ruined fingers. Silent tears traced down her cheeks as well, but a deep, serene smile blossomed on her lips. The promise made beneath the full moon years ago, sealed with a crude silver ring that defied the laws of nobility and peasants, had survived a river of blood and tears. After 5 long years, that sacred vow was finally made complete by the fragile flower rings of their children. Tell me, good listeners, how does this tale settle in your hearts? As I recount this story, my thoughts linger on that cold stone room where Elara opened the heavy door with a warm bowl of porridge in her hands. How is it possible that a woman, forced to endure a life worse than a hunted beast for 5 brutal winters, could stand before the very demon who cast her into hell and offer a warm meal without a single word of hatred? I believe it is this. Forgiveness is not a gift given to the wicked. It is the act of pulling the rusted nail of agony from one's own soul. Elara did not merely forgive Margaret, she reached into her own chest and pulled out the poisoned nail of vengeance that had festered there for 5 years. For if we carry the heavy stones of hatred in our hearts, we are the ones who will eventually be crushed beneath their weight. I thank you deeply for staying with me by the hearth fire until the very end of this long tale. If this story has warmed your spirit, I kindly ask you to leave a token of your favor, a word of praise to the storyteller, or a recommendation to your fellow travelers. Your small acts of kindness keep the hearth fire burning. Every single silver penny tossed into the cup, or a gentle nod of your head, grants me the great strength to weave the next tale. Until we meet again by the warm tavern fire, may the Lord keep you safe from the bitter winter chill. May your families always remain healthy and strong. Thank you, good travelers, and farewell to you all.